Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of In-Depth Film, a podcast dedicated to the art of cinema. My name is Greg.
And I'm Gray.
You can support this channel by liking this video, sharing it, and subscribing.
Your support really means a lot to us.
So Gray, today we're talking about Mad Max Fury Road.
Yeah, it's a movie we watched last night, and it's a movie I'm quite excited to discuss. Yeah, it was great rewatching it, because maybe we can talk about the first time we actually watched it, which was together as well. Yeah, and we were in Japan when we saw it for the first time.
Yeah, back in 2015.
Back in 2015. We went and saw it at the cinema, and I just remember being blown away. It was a real incredible cinematic experience to go and sit there in the theater and just go along on this ride of action. Yeah, it was amazing.
Yeah, I mean, at the time, you know, when you first watched Mad Max Fury Road, it can be quite an overwhelming experience because it's such a relentless assault on the senses. You know, it's an incredible visual feast. It's, in terms of sound, it's very, very loud and energetic and furious, and there's just so much going on that when we walked out of the theater, we had a sense that what we'd experienced was meaningful and powerful, but I don't think we understood exactly why. A lot of this stuff had just been so overwhelming at the time that we needed to watch it again to make sense of it.
Exactly. I remember walking out of that cinema and no one said all that much. We sort of just walked around and then finally sat down and started discussing what we just watched, which was this incredible movie, and as you say, tried to make a bit of sense of it. So it was interesting going back to it again last night and drawing a few conclusions about the movie that perhaps we didn't get on our initial viewing. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned it's quite an unconventional movie, and that was one of the things that really stood out to me rewatching it, was the pacing is quite unconventional in that it's very, very high tempo with very few breaks the entire movie. I mean, in a regular action movie, you'll have sequences which are high tempo, and then you'll have lower tempo sequences where there's more dialogue and it brings the pace down a little bit, and it just gives the audience a bit of a chance to breathe. But in Mad Max Fury Road, they really go all out and don't really stop until the end. Yeah. Yeah,
I found, I agree with you. I also found that a strange thing happens when you watch the film, in the sense that there's this uncomfortable feeling, which I think is produced by the fact that there are there are very faint anchor points, which we are used to seeing in more traditional movies. So things like an inciting incident, half an hour setup, having things explained to us, these kind of anchor a film in a story usually.
Yes.
But in this film, there's this incredible confidence, which I think is, indicative of George Miller himself, in his vision for the film. There's this confidence which basically kind of does away with all those anchor points or hooks that we're used to experiencing, or framing devices that we're used to experiencing in more traditional stories. And instead what we get is this kind of roller coaster that we just have to get on board with. It's like you just have to get into the cars with them and go along with this ride. And I think that the genius of it is that it adds to the madness of the story. And that's something that I think, watching it again last night, I was just reminded of how I think if I put myself in George Miller's shoes, the director, obviously, I can imagine that one of his ideas was something like, let's really put the mad in Mad Max, and let's make this a wild, crazy experience that really encapsulates madness,
Exactly. So maybe before we go any further, we'll just give a brief introduction to the film. So as you said, it's a 2015 Australian-made apocalyptic action film. And it's a sequel, of course, to the original Mad Max films. As you said, it's directed by George Miller, who's had quite a diverse filmography, I guess you'd say.
Yes.
He did Babe, he did Happy Feet, and of course the Mad Max films.
And so I just got to jump in there. It also just makes Mad Max that much more special to think that here's the director of Happy Feet, and here's the director of Babe, you know. This guy who's done very low-key, family-friendly films, you know, just coming out with this wild experience in the form of Mad Max Fury Road. It's very cool.
Exactly. Yeah, and some big names in it. We had Tom Hardy, of course, Charlize Theron, sort of holding the film together. And how did the film do at the box office? So it had a budget of about $150 million, and it made about $375 million. So it perhaps didn't do as well as they anticipated, but it wasn't a flop, I guess you'd say.
Right.
Yeah. But it was very successful. Got a lot of Oscar nominations, if I recall correctly, and critically was very acclaimed. Yeah.
Right. And considering the experimental nature of the film and the strangeness of the film, I think that if you put it in perspective, it's actually a very successful movie. Few films have so little dialogue, so much madness, and so much like ferocity. What's the word I'm looking for?
Ferocity,
yeah. That are able to be executed so well, and not only satisfy critics but also fans who get a whirlwind of an action experience.
Yeah, exactly. And as you mentioned, it's very interesting that he was able to make this movie defying all these sort of cinematic conventions, like the setup of the story, like the extremely fast pacing, and yet for whatever reason it still worked. And I think it's perhaps the reason why it worked and why it's such a good example is that it kind of leaned into this approach of just going 100% completely to the wall, dialing everything up to 100, having no dialogue, having the entire thing be a chase sequence. So not backing away from it, but really leaning heavily into that.
Yes.
Which is perhaps why it was successful, even though it broke all these traditional cinematic conventions. Yeah,
I also think that one of the aspects of the film which is quite interesting is the theatrical nature of the film. There's quite a strong sense of
theater, really.
Of choreography. You know, it feels like the whole film feels like a kind of morbid ballet, you know, a kind of a strange dance with cars. And it has this theatrical rhythm as well, you know, this even the way that the characters communicate to each other seems very sort of melodramatic at times.
Yes.
And yet it works.
Yes.
And I think that's a good sign of that theatrical quality.
I mean, choreographed, you mentioned the word choreographed, and I think it's quite interesting when you think about the number of stunt scenes that are in the film. So literally large chunks of the film were very carefully choreographed and blocked in a very careful manner. Because usually with most films, you know, dramas or whatnot, you'll go on set and the director will kind of work out the blocking with the actors as they go. But in this kind of a film, I feel most of the film probably was choreographed to a large extent in pre-production. And I know pre-production played an important role in this movie, and also it was done in quite an unusual manner in that instead of starting with a script, which is of course the norm, George Miller actually employed, I think it was 6 storyboard artists to come on board, and he would just describe this vision that he had for the film, shot for shot pretty much. And they came up with, I think it was 3,000 to 4,000 storyboards, which was the screenplay of the film. Any dialogue that they added actually came later, but it was first and foremost designed as a sort of visual set piece. Yeah.
Interesting. I think what I like about this film is that it's a great example of the unique experience one can only get from cinema. I really admire that about the film, is that it just demonstrates the kind of capacity for film to take us to these strange, mad places, and the way that it uses music, sound, the way that it uses color, the way that it uses performance and speed and movement. It's so, I don't know, it's so full of energy
and life, and it just amps everything up totally. Yeah. I mean, maybe even talking about the visuals a little bit, because it is a visual movie. So it was shot by John Seale, who's a very well-known DP and has had a very, very long and illustrious career as a cinematographer. And one of the things that immediately stands out to you when you watch this film, at least for me, is the grade and how saturated they made it. It's a really interesting choice, because they push the saturation of the colors far more than you usually would in a grade, almost to the extent that it starts looking almost video-y, but not in a bad way necessarily. It has a sort of comic book characteristic to it, I'd say.
Again, I think it speaks to the heightened reality that George Miller wanted to create in this film. Even the night sequences, for example, had quite a comic book feel. Yeah,
well, I mean, that's because they were shot day for night, which means that they were shot during the day in bright sunlight. Ironically, when you go that approach, you actually want as bright sunlight as possible. The brighter the sunlight, the better. And then they apply a LUT, which is a kind of a color grade to it, which gives it the appearance of night. But of course, they're not looking for a realistic version of what night looks like. So instead, they push in a lot of blue and make it this extreme, like expressionist sort of style that, of course, doesn't really exist, but which heightens the movie visually. Another technique they employed, which I thought was quite interesting, was they really messed around a lot with the frame rate that they shot it at. So most movies are usually shot at 24 frames a second, but Seale would often manipulate that at Miller's request to give this film a sort of a lot of the sequences have this sort of jerky, very fast-paced motion to them, and that comes from messing with the frame rates, making it slower or faster. And then other scenes, of course, are sort of slowed down and go into the slow motion. So a lot of the pacing of the film itself was done actually through the change of frame rate in the camera while they were shooting, which I thought was interesting. Yeah,
that is interesting. Yeah, it certainly has a very unique aesthetic, and it creates a very strange impression, for the audience. I mean, I remember watching it the first time and again last night, and just being so amazed at the kind of boldness of the visual style. It's a very bold, very confident take on this world. And yeah, to me, there's something unusual about the film and the way it feels, and that it feels, I think, because it uses a lot of practical effects and a lot of it's put a lot of emphasis on its production design. So you have a very textured, a very busy frame with a lot of parts. A lot of parts on the clothing, on the cars. Everything's rusted. Everything's worn and
literally
sandy.
A lot of moving pieces.
And so there's this sense that there's a lot going on in the frames. Obviously, they're in a desert, so the busyness I'm talking about is taking place on the cars and the characters. But what happens for me personally is that it creates this strange sense that it somehow made the film feel less Hollywood. I don't know if that's if I'm expressing myself well, but it somehow felt a bit more grounded and a bit more kind of honest and authentic.
Yes, less Hollywood is interesting. Actually. I hadn't thought about that, but it's true.
It didn't feel like a Hollywood film to me,
despite being a massive blockbuster.
But it really didn't. I mean, it felt like an experimental film made elsewhere that just had a lot of money behind it.
Yes.
Which it was kind of.
It
if you
was,
think
I
of the
guess.
fact that it's an Australian director and very much an Australian story.
Yeah. Well, as far as I know, they pretty much gave George Miller free rein to sort of do what he wanted on this film.
Yeah.
Which, again, I think is a good thing, to give directors the ability to do whatever they want and not let these massive production houses control the process of production, because it often limits the creativity and the artistic vision of the film.
Yeah. And that's what I think people picked up on in the film, is they picked up on the fact that George Miller, they sensed a vision in the movie. And that's what the film really is. It's the result of an artist's vision, a sort of an idea for a chase that no one else could really quite get their heads around. I mean, we talked last night about how even Tom Hardy, who played Mad Max, even he did not understand what he was participating in at the time. And I think that speaks to the strangeness of the vision and the fact that we could only ever see it at the end of the final product.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I remember watching the press conference at Cannes, and he actually came forward during the press conference at Cannes, Tom Hardy, and apologized to Miller and said straight up that he clearly didn't understand what was being made when they were creating this thing on set, and totally credited Miller for having the vision to be able to, because there's so many moving parts in this movie, and when you're shooting a movie like this with so many cuts, and very little narrative structure, I can imagine it would be hard on set to have a full understanding of how this movie would turn out afterwards. So it must have been very exciting watching it for the first time and seeing, oh wow, this director actually totally knew what he was doing all along, and and had a very clear vision which he executed perfectly. Yeah.
So maybe we can just talk a bit about the world before we wrap up. How much time do we have?
Sure. No, we got lots of time.
Okay. So maybe we can just talk a bit about the world and how it contributes to this wild, mad energy.
Well, I think you mentioned the production design, and a large part of that comes through in the production design, which I guess was informed by some of the early concept art and ideas of floating around in the brain of Miller. I love this sort of... I think there's a great contrast between the simplicity and sparseness of the desert, and then, as you say, all the elements of production design have this complexity to them, and everything's hand built and everything is very textural. There's nothing that looks like it was placed in frame. All the stuff that's there looks like it's been sitting there for ages. And maybe that's just the result of shooting in a desert where dust falls on everything. But either way, it really gave the production design this really weathered look, which I really enjoyed. Yeah.
I also enjoyed the strangeness of the world and the characters. You know, the strange men in white who seem to worship chrome and cars, and they had this Viking-like quality in the sense that they were kind of obsessed with war and battle and driving, and they celebrated dying in battle, you know. And there was a religious element to them as well, which was fascinating. And then you have the strangeness of the villain. You know, I don't know his name offhand.
Immortan Joe.
So that was his name. So Immortan Joe, you know, he had these boils in his back, and he had this strange armor and this funny mask,
and women producing milk.
And he was, you know, had these large obese women producing milk. Just a very strange kind of perverted world. Yes. And it's something that we seldom see. Usually that kind of world is more of a sci-fi dystopian world, which obviously this is, but usually that's in, you know, if I were to think of where I would expect to see these kinds of characters, it would be in an urban environment, like a degraded dystopian city. But I think what I enjoyed about this was the fact that they were in these caves and in the desert. It just, again, it was these wild, it was the wild contrasts in the story that made it so unusual and interesting.
Yes.
And like last night as well, we talked about the contrast between the violent masculinity, which is manifest in the brutality of these car chases and the wild men in white and all the battle sequences, and then that's contrasted with this incredible feminine energy, which we see in Charlize Theron, but obviously most acutely in the wives,
yes.
who are these beautiful women. One of them's pregnant as well, and just these contrasts of beauty and ugliness and desert and oasis and fat characters who are and then these thin
characters and strong characters and
strong and then weak and there's a wonderful contrast there.
Yeah, that's an important point. It's totally built around contrast.
And the other thing that I got to say is I also just appreciated I think he creates a mad energy in the film by showing us things that that to us are so unusual and odd. Like for example, there was one of the warlords was this really fat guy with like these nipple piercings which hung outside
yes.
of his suit with a pig nose. And he had these like huge elephant feet, obviously from like elephantitis or something. And he would have like 5 guys pick him up into his car. And just the unusualness of that, to think like in real life you would never expect to see that. Which obviously goes without saying. I'm just trying to explain why the film has such a unique energy.
Yes, yeah. Unique's definitely the word. Or maybe we can talk a little bit about the production process of the actual film. So I think Miller initially wanted to, obviously the other Mad Max films were very Australian and set in the Australian outback. And for this one, initially during production, Miller sought to make this in Australia. But I believe they had a lot of rain one year and they went to the locations they wanted to shoot at, and there was too much greenery, basically. So they sought another production location and eventually settled on Namibia as the production location. So as we're both South African and involved in the South African film industry, a lot of South African crew ended up actually shooting this movie. We've both, I think, heard quite a few stories about the production of this movie and just how intense it was, based on people we know being involved in the production.
Yeah, I mean, someone I know, one of the production managers, or I should say production coordinators, he moved his kids up there for 9 months. So he was up there for 9 months of shooting, and he said it was absolutely crazy. I think that's something else about the film which is quite funny, is that not only is the film mad, but I think the set was mad as well.
Yes. And it's an interesting observation. I'm just thinking now, you could maybe draw a parallel to a film like Apocalypse Now, where Francis Ford Coppola was very obsessed with the whole production taking place in the Philippine jungle and producing it in quite extreme conditions. And he sort of felt that the length of the production and just going to these real locations really informed everything from the performances of the actors to the creation of the story. And perhaps it was the same here. I mean, what they did is effectively moved this entire crew just into the middle of a desert for, as you say, 9 months or so. And they'd just be out in the desert shooting in very harsh conditions. And I think a lot of that just naturally comes through, whether that's in the performances or, as we say, the production design looking quite degraded, or however it may be. I think you get a feeling for that by producing it. And I think that's an important thing, by producing it practically and on the real locations, as opposed to creating an entire movie against green screens in a studio with VFX. You just get this totally different feeling that's far more visceral and energetic, I feel.
Yeah. Look, I think that VFX are only tolerable, let's put it that way, when the subject matter is so captivating that we don't really mind that it's VFX. So I'll give you a good example is Marvel. You know, these are Marvel's films have the advantage of being able to leverage a pre-existing fan base and support structure. And so for them, and the nature of the stories is so extraordinary as well. They take place in space. They're wild stories that you just can't actually do rarely with practical effects.
Yes.
So in those films, they can kind of get away with it, and they do get away with it.
Yeah.
But I think that there are a lot of films that actually don't get away with it, where it really just feels like they've lost something along the way. And as you say, the practical effects of this film, the fact that it was shot on location, it all comes through. I mean, there are so many shots in the film where they really are breathtaking, because you know that what you're watching really happened.
Yes.
And you know that even though everything was choreographed, even though everything was checked by safety experts, you know that as you're watching these scenes unfold, you know that in the back of your mind that people's lives were actually at risk. And that just creates an entirely different cinematic experience. You know, when you watch a film and you think, damn, people really went for it. You know, they really, it's like, one way of thinking about it is, you know, these guys really pushed the envelope. They took it further than we've ever seen.
Totally.
And they did in this film. I mean, there's some sequences that may never be recreated on film again.
No, I totally agree. And maybe finally, I very much agree with that point about the VFX. And I think Fury Road really is a movie that is a great example of how to use VFX to your advantage. By doing a lot of it practically, as much as you can do practically, and then sort of filling in the blanks, so to speak, with the VFX work. And as you say, also, if you're leaning heavily into this world, for example, there's one scene where they drive into this massive dust storm, and it is ridiculous, and there's lightning and all these things that would never happen.
That's a beautiful sequence.
Such a beautiful sequence.
I love that moment.
But the VFX works because...
No, it's stunning, yeah.
Yeah, only because they're heavily leaning into this world and this aesthetic, and it's not trying to be real.
And also, most of the film is real.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
so to use a little bit of VFX here and there, it's totally forgivable, and it works.
Totally agree.
Yeah. Cool, Grace. So, would you like to say anything else?
I think we've sort of covered that. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like this film is a film that I'll probably return to quite a few times in my life.
I think so.
It's a film I'm probably going to enjoy showing my kids one day, because I think that it does have a sort of timeless quality. At the end of the day, it's a classic chase movie, which in essence is the whole movie. It's one long chase.
And it's just a visual experience unlike we often get to see nowadays.
Yeah. I would say that. I would say that like a theatrical play or like an opera, it's not so much about you following the story so much as just welcoming the experience that greets you.
Exactly.
You know?
And going right back to the start, I remember that feeling when we watched it together in this theater in Japan, and just having the sound wash over you and being immersed by these incredible visuals on the big screen. It's just it's an experience, really. It's an experience of a movie. Yeah.
I think the last thing I'll say is this. I think that what I'm trying to do these days more and more is I'm trying to be a lot less critical. We've talked about this regarding our YouTube channels. I'm trying to be a lot less critical and a lot more open-minded and a lot more kind of welcoming of visions, of artistic visions. And I think that that's something that I can definitely connect to this film. It really does feel like, at the end of the day, it's a wonderfully unique artistic vision, which regardless of any shortcomings, just just by virtue of having been made at all, just deserves our attention and
deserves to be applauded.
And deserves our applause, because it's truly miraculous that a film like this even exists. If you look at the complexity of the production, the complexity of the quote unquote story, the chase sequences, I would say that it's a masterpiece.
I would agree. Cool. So if you guys have any suggestions for any movies you'd like to see us cover in a future podcast episode, we'd very much appreciate that. And also, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section below about the movie and what you thought of the movie, whether you enjoyed it, what you enjoyed about it, if you disliked it. Any comments would be appreciated.
You've been listening to In-Depth Film, a podcast about the art of cinema. I'm Greg.
And I'm Greg.
And we'll see you in the next episode.